Hello! Thank you for joining this video in which I will be presenting the results of the benchmark study of the PlantPro project. First of all, a little introduction about the PlantPro project itself. The goal of the project is to accelerate an efficient green consumer behavior transition towards a choice of eating more plant-rich diets in which they have an increased preference for upcycled foods, a better acceptance of sustainable processing innovations, and a bigger avoidance of food waste. In this benchmark study, we wanted to see what the current standing is of plant-based and upcycled foods and how this changes over time. So that means that currently we ran a survey that we will be doing again in a year and a half and about 3 years from now to see how the consumer perceptions change over time. And two example questions of this benchmark are: what is the perception of the products that are plant-based meat or dairy replacement at the moment, and does this change over time? Or what is the knowledge about these products, and does this change over time? So without further ado, let me present to you the results of this benchmark survey. First, a little bit of information about the sociodemographics. We did our survey with the help of user needs, and we aimed to have 1,200 Danish participants as a representative sample of the country. In the end, we collected data from 1,222 participants, and we kept the data for analyses of 1,126. The few that were removed failed an attention check or control question throughout the survey. The general demographics of the sample that we had in the end was 545 males and 581 females, with a distribution across the major cities that is indeed representative of the country. And their current level of education and their household income is also representative of Denmark, with the majority finishing a master's degree or medium or long cycle higher education, and 44% having a normal or average income. Then on to plant-based awareness. First, we asked people about their familiarity with plant-based brands. We did this in two different ways. First, we asked them in a free recall which brands they could think of that they know work with plant-based meat or dairy. And the second one was a list of brands in which they were asked to tick as many as they recognized. We also asked them about their trust in the plant-based brands that they've seen, asking how trustworthy overall they think these brands were. So first of all, the free recall. Around 50% of people said that they didn't know or couldn't think of any plant-based brand. And for the brands that were recognized, Naturli was by far recognized or reported the most, with 24% of people reporting Naturli in the free recall. When it comes to the recognition of brands, again, Naturli did best. Around 64% recognized this brand in a list, with Oertekam and Knorr and Hanegal coming second, third, and fourth. Of course, I want to mention it is not the case that these are exclusively plant-based brands or have to be plant-based brands. It's just that people recognize these products as having something plant-based. For example, Knorr does not only have plant-based products, they also have animal-based products, but because they also have some plant-based products, they were recognized within this list. Then regarding trust, the mean score was a 4.7, whereas the range was 1 to 7, a 1 meaning that they didn't think these brands were trustworthy at all, and a 7 meant that they were absolutely trustworthy. So overall, we can say that the majority of people did think that these brands were fairly trustworthy, with almost 60% scoring it either a 5, 6, or 7. Then moving on to upcycling awareness. We first asked people about their familiarity with upcycled foods, and asked them how familiar they were with a list of terms that I will be presenting on the next slide, meaning that they have either heard of the term or know what it stands for. We then told them that upcycled foods use ingredients that otherwise would not have gone to human consumption and that this reduces food waste, and then asked them what their thoughts were about upcycled foods. We averaged their score of these 3 items to get to an average attitudinal score, and the 3 items were as follows. First, we asked them if eating or drinking these products is bad to good. Then, if they were strongly against or strongly for eating or drinking any of these products. And finally, if they disliked to liked eating or drinking any of these products, where first, again, a 1 was the most negative and a 7 was the most positive. So, the results. Familiarity rating in percentages can be seen here in this graph, with a 1 being red is it being not familiar at all with the term, and the dark blue is 7 being very familiar with the term. And we can very clearly see that most people are not familiar at all with the term. On the left-hand side, you can see the mean scores for each of the items, and there we can see that side stream is the term that people are least familiar with, whereas buy or co-products is the term that people are most familiar with, but all of them scoring fairly low on a 1 to 7 scale. Then their thoughts about upcycled food with the attitudinal average that I talked about. We can see here that we got the full range from 1 to 7, but on average 47% of people scored this negatively, scoring it either a 1, 2, or 3. 20% scored neutral, and 33% scored positively with a 5, 6, or 7. So on average, the attitude at the moment is ambiguous, but leaning towards slightly more negative than positive. Then moving on to the current self-reported behavior of the consumers that participated in the survey. First question being how many people they know who have reduced their meat consumption or who do not eat much meat. We can see here that 24% of people report not knowing anyone at all, meaning that around 76%, do know someone or a few people that have reduced their meat, ranging to all the way up to 7, where it's almost everybody they know, even though this was only reported by 2.6% of our sample. So there are a fair amount of people who know at least someone that have reduced their meat consumption or do not eat much meat. Then the statement that describes themselves best. The majority of people, 75% around and about, see themselves as meat eaters, whereas almost 20% see themselves as flexitarians, and only 2 to 1.5%, give or take, see themselves as either pescatarian, vegetarian, or vegan. Then moving on to the frequency of their own meat consumption. Here we see that 42% of people report that they eat meat and or fish 6 to 7 days out of the week. Around 36% say that they eat meat or fish 4 to 5 times out of the week. And only 50% limit their meat and or fish intake to 2 to 3 times out of the week. And only fewer, 1.5 to 3%, either eat vegetarian supplemented with some fish, do not eat meat or fish, or do not eat any kind of animal-based foods at all. Then the frequency of their own plant-based meals. Here we've split this up over lunches and dinners, and we see that for lunches it is more common to be eating plant-based meals than for dinners, with 27.4% reporting that they eat a vegetarian lunch 4 or more days out of the week, and 16.5% reporting vegetarian dinners 4 or more days out of the week. We also asked our consumers about their frequency of their plant-based replacement products on the left-hand side. Here in blue, you can see the plant-based dairies, and in red, the plant-based meat products. And we see that over 50% report never eating these plant-based dairies or plant-based meats, and around 20 to 25% reporting eating this less than once a month. So fairly little current consumption of plant-based replacement products. On the right-hand side, we see the frequency of current consumption for plant-based foods, with in green the vegetables, so carrots, salads, those kinds of things, and in yellow the legumes, being peas, beans, lentils, and such. And we see that vegetables are more commonly consumed than legumes, but both are consumed several times a week, up to several times per day. Then moving on to the role of meat, we told our participants that the role of meat has been discussed a lot lately and what their view was, and asked them to rate the extent to which they either agreed or disagreed with any of the following statements. And again, ranging this from 1 to 7, where 1 was strongly disagree and a 7 was strongly agree. And we see that all over the spectrum, for meat being beneficial for health, climate, environment, being an important part of a healthy diet, and being able to be produced in a climate friendly or environmentally friendly way. Over all of these questions, people do agree with them to some extent, ranging from 4.10 to 5.15. Then moving on to the perceived conflict and the perception of others. First of all, for perceived conflict, again, we gave people several statements in which they could state how much they disagreed, which would be a 1, or completely agreed, which was a 7 on. The first statement being, I perceive the public discussion around food as highly polarized, and here we see that around 57% of people agreed, so scoring this a 5, 6, or 7. The second one was, I would like people to be more tolerant towards different dietary choices. And again, we see that the majority of people, almost 70%, agree with this statement. Next, we asked people if they felt judged for their food choices, and around 60% of people disagreed, and 23% of people agreed with this statement. Then we said, I think food consumption is a matter of personal freedom, and 71% of our participants agreed with this statement. The next one was, when someone appears to lecture me about which foods to eat, I found myself reacting with the opposite. Here we got scores that ranged all over the spectrum, with 40% of people disagreeing with this, 25% of people being neutral, and 33% of people agreeing. And finally, the last statement of conflict was, I perceive there is a narrative based on us versus them when it comes to eating meat or plant-based foods, and here the majority of people agreed, with 61% of people scoring this either a 5, 6, or 7. So overall from these we can conclude that there is at least some level of perceived conflict. Then moving on to the perception of others, we measured this by using different vignettes. We had 10 people represented on these vignettes, and all of our participants were shown 1 out of 10 of these people and were asked to rate how likely it was that this person would be eating a predominantly plant-based diet. I will give you 3 examples of these vignettes. The first one being Christian, who is 31 years old, self-employed, and living in Randas. He spends the majority of his time at his office. He eats takeaway more often than not, and when he is off from work, he stays active at boxing practice or goes to town with his friend. The second example is Mette, who is 47 years old, works as a theater instructor, and is a mother of 3. She lives in an apartment on Frederiksberg, enjoys cooking her own meals, and in her spare time she practices yoga and meets up with her friends at local cafes. And then the third example finally is Jeppe, who is 61 years old and a retiree from working as a DSB technician. He lives with his wife in their common house in Viborg and enjoys growing his own vegetables in their garden. So we asked people again to rate how likely it was that any of these people would be eating a predominantly plant-based diet. And here we see the results. We're in dark blue and light blue. We see that for Christian and Jeppe, this is deemed less likely than for Mette, who is in green, who is much more scored as being positive on this. I want to also highlight that around 10% for each of these vignettes was scored as I do not know. And the next thing I will be discussing with you is the reasoning why. And for the I don't know, people most often said that they don't know this person, so they could not possibly judge what this person would be eating. However, for Christian, Mette, and Jeppe, the following reasons were given most frequently. For Christian, it was that he is eating a lot of convenience food or that he really likes to exercise as reasons for why he would either not or yes be eating more plant-based. For Mette, this is based on status, the fact that she likes yoga, and her lifestyle. And finally, for Jeppe, the reasoning most often given is either his age, his gender, or the fact that he likes gardening. Finally, we also asked people what they consider to be typically Danish. And here you can see that eating seaweed, eating a meal with legumes, or eating a plant-rich diet scored the lowest in being typically Danish, whereas eating a meat-rich diet, drinking milk, eating pork, and eating cake for a birthday were considered most Danish. So then the overall conclusion, we can say that there is a low free recall of plant-based brands, but fairly good recognition. That there is fairly high trust in plant-based foods, but a fairly low willingness to eat exclusively plant-based. That there is low familiarity with upcycled foods. And currently people eat more plant-based lunches than dinners. There is currently fairly low consumption of plant-based dairy and plant-based meat replacements. And there seems to be a perception of conflict towards plant-based eating. And finally, eating meat-rich, drinking milk, and eating pork is considered Danish, whereas eating plant-based seaweeds or eating legumes is not. And of course, the most interesting part in all of this is not these results in and by themselves, but will be to see if these perceptions and current behaviors change over time. So I welcome you to visit this website again in a year and a half from now to see then the updated results of the survey and the comparison between this benchmark and the next time we'll be running it. I thank you very much for your attention, and don't hesitate to contact any of us here at the PlantPro project should you have any questions.